Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another Survivor Top 10 player video, continuing off of a previous video where I did a video of my top 10 non-winning players based on their first appearance, and here we'll be doing the more general list where we're including winners. And straight up, this entire top 10 ends up comprising of winning players, which ends up being kind of weird that none of the non-winning players end up scratching the top 10, though obviously the top 2 from that list did come relatively close, but not quite make it on. So here in this top 10 players based on their debut seasons, this will be solely talking about winners of the game. And with that, let's just jump right into it. Again, we'll be talking about the honorable mentions. Again, these will all be winners, and I'll be talking about them in the order that they first played. Let's start off with Tina Wesson, who again would be a consideration here. I do feel like she, especially for the time, was a pretty savvy player, one that kind of weaponized the good person persona, but also the reaction to Survivor Borneo in order to set up her game, which I do think is pretty impressive. But at the same time, I don't know how effective that game would be in the modern day, especially without any other proof to her. So I do feel like I would look at her as a pretty inconsistent player based off just her first appearance. Next up, we got Ethan, who I also would look at as somewhat inconsistent, but in an opposite way. Not inconsistent in terms of his longevity, as I feel like Ethan is the type of player that would always make it far, but more so a question mark on if he would win if he got to the end. Where while he is a very likable presence, he is one that did not come off as the most game savvy his first time around. And I do feel like we see more of his game ability on All Stars, but just based off of his first appearance, he was very much playing into this good guy persona and played with honesty and loyalty, which wouldn't make me put much confidence in him just based off that first appearance, especially with him wanting to go to the end with Lex in a situation where Lex probably beats him, even though again it's pretty close, but still not a great display of gameplay there, especially from a modern perspective in my eyes. So did not put him in the top 10. Also did not put on Vesepia, who again, like, there's a lot of talk about how great of a player Vesepia would be. However, I don't fully see it. Like, I do think she is well-rounded in the sense that she is good physically, she is very good socially, and she has a competent strategic mind. However, I feel like those things never fully click on Marquesas, to where I think she is largely getting benefited by things that other players are doing, while also making some suboptimal moves at points, and was a target at multiple points despite this talk about how great her social game was. And while again, I do think she makes that very cutthroat move of flipping on Kathy at the very end, that also ends up burning her jury votes. And again, like, I just feel like overall, I do think there are impressive things to call out for Vesepia, but not quite enough to land her in the top 10 for me. Also, an honorable mention here is Brian Heidick, who, again, I just don't see Brian Heidick doing well if he were to play the modern game. I just don't think he would adapt to the modern game particularly well. Again, I think his first time around, I think he was able to dominate a season like Thailand, but I think a season like Thailand was even abnormal for the time. I really just feel like Brian's gameplay tactics would not work in a modern day scenario, and I just do not look at him as, and I would not assess him too high in the modern day. Next one is a bit of a question mark for me, and that person is Chris Doherty, who I did very much consider for this top 10, and I do think he barely misses out on the list here to the person in the number 10 spot, but he is a person that played from both the top and the bottom. However, I will say that I think when playing in the top, I do think he makes some questionable decisions. I really just never felt like he needed to lie to Julie and Eliza as much as he did, which could have potentially burned him jury votes. Though at the same time, he does demonstrate that he has some good game ability while on the bottom, where, I mean, while I do think at the end of the day, he was definitely benefited from lucky circumstances, he also does play up his relationships very well. He does very effectively utilize his relationships with Scout and Twyla and Eliza in order to solidify that new majority, and still has his relationship with Julie. And again, at the end, at Final Tribal, he does very effective work in securing those jury votes. And just overall, like, Chris is a mixed game for me. However, I do feel like there's a level of smarminess there that makes me question if he would be able to do that on a return. So he didn't quite make the top 10. Danny Boatwright is a player I definitely considered here, where I think based off just her first appearance, there was definitely a lot of question marks on Danny, on how she would do on a return, how much game ability she really had the first time around, where obviously like we get this talk about how she didn't tell the producers her true strategy because she was worried that they would leak that strategy to others. And I feel like that definitely boosted people's opinions on her before Winners at War. And I do feel like, again, I think she comes off as a pretty well-rounded player. I mean, she's very good physically, she is very good socially, and strategically, she had a lot of control on her original starting tribe. So, I mean, there definitely is a lot to like here for Danny. However, I just feel like the question marks around her were enough to not quite make her make the top 10. Next up, we're jumping forward quite a bit, all the way to Survivor South Pacific. We'll be talking about Sophie. And again, just based off of her first appearance, I would have had a lot of doubts on Sophie's win equity. I do think she still comes off as a very well-rounded player for the most part on South Pacific. Again, I think socially is probably her biggest issue, to where she did seem to come off as very cold to people, where to the people outside of her alliance, she didn't seem to have the greatest relationships with them, but she was still very good physically, a very astute strategic player, but one that I do think would have struggled in a lot of jury scenarios, and because that she didn't quite make the top 10. Also did not put on Denise, who, I mean, I've never been particularly high on Denise's game. While I think she demonstrated a lot of good game ability to navigate through Matt Singh, I do think a lot of her post-merge game is extremely lacking, with her losing a lot of her agency in the game and really having to be strong-armed into taking Malcolm out at the very end, which was her game-winning scenario. So again, I feel like those things are things that left her off the top 10 for me. Also off the top 10 here is Tony, who, again, I love Tony. At this point, I would say Tony is the best player of all time. However, again, if we're just basing it on KWON, I would have thought he would have been a very inconsistent player. I mean, at the time, KWON felt like a very strange anomaly of a season, one where Tony's game felt like very unrepeatable. So, again, if we're just basing it off that one appearance, there's no way I can place Tony too highly. And the final honorable mention here was a bit of a tough person to land for me, and that person is Mike Holloway. And Mike's an interesting case here because I do think at the end of the day, he does demonstrate that he is a very well-rounded player, but also obviously made strategic mistakes along the way that caused him to be in this position where he needed to win out. But the fact that he does actually win out does give a lot of credence to his physical ability there, where I think out of the majority of players to ever play Survivor, Mike Holloway is one of the people that I would have the most confidence in winning out, as we literally saw him do it. Winning 5 of the last 6 immunity challenges, and the one that he didn't win, he had an idol for. So that is a aspect of his game that I would be pretty high on, mixed in with the fact that he is also a big fan of the game, knows the game very well. While he made, again, those strategic errors, I do feel like he also had some decent strategic play along the way. But I do feel like his jury management points was lacking. Plus, also, again, while I do put some credence into his physical ability for the sake of this player ranking, I don't think it's quite enough to quite crack the top 10. Especially when we haven't really seen him maintain control towards the end game. But again, those are the honorable mentions. Now let's get into the top 10 itself. At number 10 here, the bottom of this list, again, for me, him and Chris Doherty were pretty close. However, I did end up siding with Nick Wilson, which, again, might be a controversial choice, considering I feel like Nick Wilson is not looked at super favorably as a player. And I feel like his David vs. Goliath game is usually not talked about super fondly. I do think a lot of that stems from the fact that I think it has a very rocky end, where I think the tail end of his game is one where essentially he wins out. He wins the final 3 immunity challenges. Now, I think you can debate how much he really needed those, though at the same time, I think his winning of those final 3 immunity challenges actually boosts my opinion of his game. It shows me that he has this ability to win challenges if he absolutely needs to. While beyond that, I think he's a very strong social and strategic player in the game. Now, again, I think also his first round is definitely something to call out, where I think maybe that can lend credence to some inconsistency in his game. Though even in that scenario, he would have had a lot of allies to potentially try to save him there. And really just overall, like, I think Nick Wilson is a very strong social and strategic player. I think he is very good at building these relationships with these people that want to keep him around, where despite it for sure not being in Mike White or Angelina's best interest to take him to the end of the game, they still were planning on taking him to the end of the game. Also strategically, again, like, I think he is a very strong strategic player. Again, he creates the plan for the minority vote split. split and executes that John Hennigan blindside, while also, again, being so good socially to where he's able to have most of the information that he needs to properly execute those moves. Now, I will say that I do think he gets a bit emotional at points, and that can taint his gameplay a bit. So again, there definitely are downsides to Nick here. However, I felt like the fact that he demonstrated that he can win out, plus also mixing in his very strong social and strategic ability through most of the season, it was enough to crack the top 10 here. Now, number 9, we're moving on to another player I was kind of a bit unsure on what exactly to do with, considering the fact that someone directly tied to him did not make the list, though debatably could have. But at number 9, I did go with Wendell. And by this, I'm essentially saying that Wendell is a better player than Dominic. Where despite the fact that I think Dominic played a better overall game on Ghost Island, and I personally would have voted for Dominic in that situation, I do think Wendell as a whole is probably the better player. I would have more confidence in Wendell in any given season over Dominic. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that I think Wendell is much more well-rounded. I think he is another extremely well-rounded player in all 3 facets of the game. I think he is very good physically, and while he's not to the point where he's the most consistent physical competitor in the world, he is still very solid. He's very good socially, builds such strong bonds to the point where that's why he gets most of the votes that he gets at the end, is because of his social relationships with the likes of a Sebastian, a KWON, and also the respect for the social game that he played is the reason why he gets the vote of a Chelsea, and is also, again, still a very competent strategic thinker. Again, I just feel like Wendell is a very well-rounded player based on how we saw him in Ghost Island. Though the reason he's not higher on this list is because I would have questioned if he had the killer instinct, considering the fact that he never actually turns on Dom until the tail end of the game, when it's already too late. So again, for me, that was enough to put him in the top 10, but not towards the top of the list. He's here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a player that my opinion on this player has definitely gone down over time. However, just based on their first appearance, I was very high on this player, and that is Natalie Anderson. And Natalie Anderson's San Juan del Sur game is very, very strong. To where while she's not an extremely active player early on, she is very well positioned. The fact that she is the second in command to Jeremy, and obviously she gets blindsided when Jeremy goes home, but from that point forward, she plays a near perfect game. Still finding her way into the majority alliance while building up an army to flip the game on John Mish, while also expertly managing the jury, and really as a whole just demonstrating a lot of really impressive game ability on that season, taking a lot of risks, which ironically we don't see her do on their second appearance. But I do feel like her first appearance, particularly in the back half of it, demonstrates some near perfect survivor play, where I really have no true flaw with the way she plays from the final 9 on. And she's also a player that I think on most given seasons, I would have a decent amount of confidence in making a deep run, though considering the fact that we did see Nadia being the first boot, maybe I shouldn't have. But I mean, again, I just feel like overall, Natalie's a player that I would have a decent amount of confidence in just based off her San Juan del Sur game. And while that confidence is definitely lowered in the modern day, at the time I would be particularly high on her. So she's here at number 8. Now number 7, moving on to a player, and really the next 4 players we'll be talking about are a stretch of players that I've talked about in numerous videos, some of which might not be out yet, but I already have this ranking kind of built upon another ranking that might come out at some point, with all these players being middle school players of Survivor, specifically coming from before Survivor Micronesia. At number 7, we're starting that group off with TODD HERZOG. And again, Todd for me, I think, is one of the best strategic players to ever play the game. I think he has this full understanding of the game of Survivor, which I think is very rare for someone playing, especially at the point that he played Survivor. I really feel like up until the point that he plays in China, I would look at him as one of the best strategic thinkers in the history of the show. Or I do feel like there are holes in Todd's game, particularly the fact that his initial jury management was kind of lacking, to where coming into Final Tribal, he wasn't really secured in having the win, though through his Final Tribal performance, which he was able to articulate his strategy very effectively and butter up the likes of a John Robert, it does end up really improving his overall game ability there, to where it seems like he's able to rectify these earlier missteps in jury management. So mixing that the fact that he just straight up dominates his season of Survivor China, it does make me look at him very highly. However, I think in comparison to the next few we'll be talking about, who also demonstrate a lot of game ability, but also are more well-rounded as players, that does leave Todd a bit further behind here at number 7. Now number 6, we have a player that, again, is a very well-rounded player. I think my issue with this player is threat level, where I think this player mismanages his threat level the most out of this group. And at number 6, we do have Tom Westman. And again, Tom is a very well-rounded player in the sense that he is one of the best physical competitors we've ever seen, winning 5 out of 7 immunity challenges after the quote-unquote merge, essentially winning out at the tail end of the game, which is, again, impressive from a physical standpoint. Socially, he is very good. Again, like, I think he did come off as a bit misogynistic at points and did have some poor jury management with the likes of a Kobe, but still, overall, was a player that did garner a lot of respect, and I think definitely was very intentional in the way that he approached his relationship building that I think is very impressive. And then strategically, I think he is a very solid player as well, being a very cutthroat player, being a very manipulative player, and one that does have the killer instinct and knowing when to strike against his opponent, but also being a master at guilt tripping, particularly the likes of Ian, where he just really runs circles around him after learning the fact that Ian was coming for him. And again, all that is impressive. However, again, I just feel like on most given appearances, I do feel like he just comes off as such a blatant threat at the merge to where if he doesn't win out, I think he's screwed. And like, again, we did see him win out, so good on him for that. But I just feel like on most given appearances, he would be targeted along the way, and knowing the variance and challenges, I still feel like I can't place him much higher here than number 6. Now, number 5, moving on to a player that I feel like my respect for this person's Cook Islands game probably has gone up since the last proper time I've talked about it, even though I still think they were lucked out by certain circumstances, but that person is Yule. Yeah, I feel like Yule, like, while yes, he was lucked out by things like the bottle twist and his god idol being valid at the very last opportunity to be voted out, I still just feel like overall Yule is a very well-rounded player. Again, also being another one of the most impressive strategic minds in the history of the show, but mixing that in with the fact that he is also very physical to the point where while he didn't win any immunity challenges, again, he was facing off against Ozzy and was also intentionally throwing those challenges to Ozzy, to where I think he is someone that definitely could have won his fair share of immunity challenges, but also was a solid social player as well, to where while I think most people look at him as solely a strategic player, I think he also knew how to cultivate these very strong personal relationships to where he had the likes of Becky and Sandra being unwilling to turn against him, despite knowing how big of a threat he could be. However, I think something that kind of elevates my opinion of Yule in the modern day is also now taking into context the fact that he was on Survivor Cook Islands, a season that obviously was propped up as this race war season, and through that, Yule had a lot of pressure on him to want to represent for the Asian American community, where I feel like that did put a bit of a burden on him to where he was unwilling to play a bit more all out in terms of his strategic game, to where I feel like on most other appearances he would be able to fully demonstrate that. And I feel like that's kind of elevated my opinion of Yule's game to where it kind of feels like his Cook Islands game is a game where he's like intentionally holding back. And considering how impressive a game it is in its own right, for me that does leave him here at number 5. Now number 4, moving on to, again, one of the most naturally gifted players Survivor has ever seen, being someone that knew absolutely nothing about the game coming into it, yet plays an extremely dominant game at that, and that person is Earl Cole. And again, Earl plays a very impressive game, being one that learned the game on the fly and somehow was still able to play this extremely dominant game, where despite coming from the old Ravu tribe, which lost a majority of its members by the end game, he was still able to create this new majority after a swap and allow them to run the game. Now, also, I should mention that part of that comes from the fact that they did spend time all together as one group before the first immunity challenge, which created this builders versus explorers dynamic, which definitely helped Earl in that situation. But still, the fact that he was able to learn the game so quickly and put this group together and also keep that group together is extremely impressive. We also saw that he does have the killer instinct, and the fact that he was able to cut Yao Man at the point that he needed to. And while again, I think at the end of the day, he probably still wins against Yao Man, I think that demonstrates a level of killer instinct that also ends up booning him as a player. Again, he's just another one of these very well-rounded players, but considering the fact that he came into Fiji not knowing much about the game and played as impressive a game as he did, and really him not having as many holes in his game as someone like a Yule or a Tom or a Todd, it ends up elevating his placement here to be at number 4. Now, number 3, we're moving on to a player that, again, my opinion of this player has always been somewhat controversial, and I feel like, again, it still stems from people not really giving this person the respect that they're due for the game that they played. And at number 3, I do have Tommy SHEEHAN from IOI. I just think Tommy's winning game on IOI is a unicorn. It is a game that, from a pure player perspective, demonstrates perfectly him playing from both the top and the bottom. Again, for me, with the player ranking, with someone like an EARL or a TODD, hesitancies of putting them much higher on the list is the fact that we haven't really seen them face adversity. They were at the top of their groups the entire game. However, someone like Tommy is someone that demonstrates both the ability to play from the top well, but also the ability to play from the bottom. And also in a position where all the times he was at the bottom were not really due to mistakes that he made. Again, he gets swapped into a not super advantageous position where he then gets screwed over by a lane essentially just being handed an advantage that ends up taking out one of his closest allies, and that ends up being one of the only reasons why he's potentially in danger after a swap. We then have him being screwed over by a split tribal twist where all of his allies are on the other side, yet somehow he's still able to cultivate this flip against Missy. We then also have his entire endgame perfectly set up at the very end for him to have an easy win against Dan and Dean, who just outright had the numbers at the final 6, only for Dan's ejection to then give him a tougher road, and him having to take out Janet at 5 and Lauren at 4 instead of at 6 and 5 as intended. Like, Tommy played a game that faced a lot of adversity, yet despite that, overcame all of that. But even beyond that, again, he also played from the top very well, where when he was in control, I think he always made the correct decisions on how to approach the game. Again, being in a position where he was running the game alongside Lauren, but was severely undercutting her along the way. Now, again, I think at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest flaws is the fact that I don't think he did enough to undercut her to the point where he would outright win a jury vote against her. However, he undercut her enough to where he always planned on taking her out before the end, and was also weakening her along the way by taking out these potential allies for her. So again, I feel like Tommy perfectly demonstrated how to play from both the top and the bottom over the course of just his one game. The only reason he's not higher is because his win equity was not as high as the next 2 people we'll be talking about. So because that, for me, he is here number 3. Now, number 2, we have a player that, again, my opinion of their game as a whole has gone down over time just due to rockier future appearances, but just based off their first appearance, at number 2, I do have JT. And JT's Tocantins game is a very impressive game, another game that really demonstrates a lot of skills for the game. While I do have issues with the fact that he had to essentially win out at the end by winning the last few immunity challenges, he also wins the last few immunity challenges, showing his overall comp ability that ends up elevating him as a player. I mean, he ends up being another one of these people that ends up running this game in a duo alongside Steven. And while he doesn't undercut his opponent in the way that someone like a Tommy does, he just naturally has this charisma about him that makes him a very clear winner if he gets to the end. I think he wins against literally anybody in the game, where even the next biggest jury threat on the board in Steven ends up being shut out against him at the end. But also, again, I think JT has also demonstrated the ability to play from the bottom, where again, coming into the merge, Jalapal was down at one point 3-6. And we see JT being the reason why Coach ends up wanting to work with the Jalapals. And while, I mean, at the end of the day, it is Coach, so I don't know how much consistency there necessarily is than that. But it does still show some very impressive game ability there from JT, showing his very strong social ability and also his ability to flip the game around, where, again, I think you have to share credit with him with Steven, where I think they were working in lockstep, but through flipping over Aaron and taking out Tyson, they end up running the game from the final 7 on. And again, just JT has a near perfect game in Survivor Tocantins, especially when we're assessing him from a player perspective. So because that, for me, he's here at number 2. And now number 1. This wasn't really a question. I think before Winners at War, I would have probably had this person as the best player of all time, despite them only being a one-time player at that point. So at number 1, I do have Kim SPRADLIN. And I think the one criticism of this position is the fact that Kim never really played from the bottom. Again, despite me talking about JT and Tommy and the things that elevate them being the fact that they played from the bottom, Kim doesn't have that. However, I think something that Kim has that I don't think any other player in the history of Survivor US has, I think really only one other person comes to mind in all of International Survivor that has this, is the fact that Kim essentially had the game won from as far back as the final 7 for sure, but even debatably before that. Where Kim on One World has a game that is, for me, by far the best game of Survivor I've ever seen be played. Being a game where, by the time of the final 7, she had literally everyone left in the game wanting to go to the final 3 with her, while also her being in a position where she would beat everyone in the final 3. And that is really an insane position to be in. While also being in a position where I think she literally beats everybody in the season in a jury vote. Where obviously, like, it's pretty intangible to look at the people from extremely early on. But I think from the merge on, I do not see how she loses a jury vote against any of those people in any final 3 scenario. So again, I mean, like, in terms of just the game that Kim played, obviously that is extremely impressive, but even beyond that, Kim is a player that I would just have so much confidence in. I mean, Kim is just so skilled at all 3 facets of the game. She is extremely physical, one of the best physical female competitors in the history of the show. She is a masterful social player, with the only blemish on her winning game being the fact that she does have poor jury management of both Leaf and Troy. Though even then, like, while in the game, she had a good relationship with Troy Zan. Really, Leaf is the only player that she never really had that good of a relationship with on the season. And from a strategic standpoint, again, also master at positioning herself in the game. Literally everyone left in the game wanted to take her to the end by the end game, while also leading the charge for the women to take control of the game, while also leaving herself with so many options in the game. Again, it is an insane game that she plays on One World, so insane to the point where, despite the flaw of not knowing exactly how she would play from the bottom, I just feel like her overall game ability that she displayed on that season far exceeds every other player based on their first appearance, and because that, for me, Kim lands here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my top 10 players based on their first appearance. Now, moving forward, obviously, I will continue to do the same Survivor Big Brother style videos, other rankings, so stay tuned for those. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.